Um, Thank you, panel, and I want to thank Professor Salim and His Excellency Bishwambar Pyakurayal, and thanks for delegating to me the responsibility to share our group's deliberations, which were very exciting and stimulating. And the chairperson ensured that we stayed to the 3 questions that were asked to us. So I would just go ahead with the 3 questions. First was, who are the key stakeholders? In our group, we said that some of the, keeping in mind the SDG Goal 8, the primary stakeholders for this are the unemployed youth, which is a feature common across the region. It is people who are deprived of decent jobs, in particular women, who form a large chunk of people who are working in the informal sector, migrants, Dalits, Adivasis, and other disenfranchised communities. Trade unions are an important stakeholder of SDG Goal 8. Businesses, especially small and medium enterprises who are not well organized and not well represented. And finally, the government. But we believe that all these form the stakeholders for effective implementation of Goal 8. In terms of the barriers, our group felt there were primarily systemic barriers that existed in the successful implementation for the goal. The first barrier that was discussed was an economic model. It was discussed that the model that we have primarily followed in our region of economic growth, which has ignored the manufacturing sector, has led to a situation where there is growth with very few jobs. And that has created a very challenging context for the entire region. It has also been responsible for the large informal sector that exists. And again, as we said, because it is primarily composed of women working in the informal sector who are then open to who are more vulnerable and do not have any social protection. The other systemic structure is the social structures. We discussed about social discriminations, which are because of based on work and birth, and which particularly faced by women, again Dalits and Adivasis, and which govern which work these people can do and which work they cannot do. And they get caught into these boxes and unable to take opportunity of the growth that it presents. Unpaid care work was especially mentioned as an important obstacle for women, which the reports, as we all know, there are UN reports which talk about how women disproportionately shoulder the burden of unpaid care work, and which also leads their, makes them participate in the workforce on a very unequal footing. Government policies, which are well-intentioned, but many times limited on paper, they do not engage with the labor market on a real-time basis. Many of them are also, there are skill programs across the regions which governments have undertaken. However, it was discussed that they were gendered and underfunded, and therefore they were not able to generate the kind of employment that has been envisaged and hoped for. We discussed that there is a need for an ecosystem approach. There was an example given of a maternity leave, which we felt was a very symbolic gesture. But we discussed that if we want to bring women into the workforce, it is important to have an ecosystem approach where we look at safety, we look at issues of violence, we look at the existence of creches, social infrastructure, a whole lot of investment across various SDGs that will ensure that SDG 8 is implemented effectively. The group also discussed about the challenge of automation and the threat of artificial intelligence, which probably would make generating jobs even more difficult in the years to come. And the lifestyle patterns, overconsumption, wastage, and lack of efficiency was shared as another challenge. Some of the solutions that we discussed, the first was that the government must take lead on policy making, but in a context that the region faces of inequality and all the challenges we have mentioned. The feeling in the group was that the government cannot restrict itself to policy making. It needs to become more active. Public investment in employment and job creation was shared as one important way which can help disrupt some of these disparities that we are talking about and inequalities. To encourage private investment such that the small-scale investors can be helped with adequate policies and to create jobs. Skilling programs need to be flexible and must incorporate life skills and rights-based education, and they should be accessible to resource-poor women and men. Labor augmenting technologies instead of labor replacing technologies need to be looked at. And most importantly, all the stakeholders need to work on social norms and attitudes, which are one of the primary deterrent to people getting decent jobs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I now request Dr. Mustafizur Rahman, Distinguished Fellow at CPD Dhaka, to make a presentation. Dr. Mustafizur Rahman, Distinguished Fellow, CPD Dhaka, to summarize the discussion on SDG 10. Mr. Furji, it's a limited over.
Yeah. Yeah, we are doing good in limited overs, as you know. Thank you, Chair. Let me first of all register my deep appreciation to my team who have contributed excellently in the deliberations that we had. And we had two initial comments from Ms. Chintani and Mr. Omitabo Behar, and I'm very grateful for their inputs in the discussion, and also all of our colleagues. What we have decided is that SDG 10, reducing inequality within and across countries, is the fulcrum SDG, in the sense that if we look at the SDGs, the three pillars, then first is the economic growth and second is the social inclusiveness. So what we find is that inequality, if we can address inequality, we can not only guarantee social inclusiveness, but addressing inequality has also emerged as a major factor in terms of economic growth. And what we see from global literature as well, that countries which start with lower inequality, they tend to grow faster. So this is something which is very important. But on the other hand, inequality is not only an outcome, but also an input to greater inequality. So it's a vicious cycle. So that was the general pattern. And in spite of the fact that in South Asia we have done quite good in terms of reducing poverty and the percentage of people and the number of people below the poverty line, but what we see from evidence is that in almost all the South Asian countries, inequality is increasing. And we have data for India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. We see that if we take Gini coefficient, then the Gini coefficient of inequality is increasing. And we also see that across the countries, across the world also, the 99% movement and the 1% having 50% of the global wealth. So what we find is that in terms of consumption inequality, there has been some improvement because of the social safety net programs, but in terms of income inequality and wealth and asset inequality, there has been a deterioration. So we have to keep that in mind. And keeping that in mind, we try to identify three issues: identification of the reasons of inequality, the nature of the vulnerabilities, and how to go forward. And we see that one of the major reasons of inequality is as was very rightly mentioned by Mr. Professor Omitabo Kundo, is the structural reasons of the inequality, particularly education and health. And if you look at, and he has very rightly mentioned that, and some of the evidence also says that 25% of the, in terms of HDI, the major reasons is structural inequalities, access to education and health, originating from lack of those. So this is one which came out very sharply. The other that came out in the discussion was some of the laws and regulations in our countries, which also perpetuates inequality. Laws and regulations which go against those who are in socially backward in our societies. The other reasons is also we find the identification. We find that those where the fiscal contribution is relatively less, allocation is relatively less, there also some of the reasons of the inequality also comes up. In Bangladesh, for example, Dr. Deopriya Bhattacharya, in the context of Bangladesh, we have identified 12 indicators of vulnerabilities. And what inspired from the discussion is that it is contextual. In some countries, the inequality arises from lack of, for example, infrastructure. In Nepal and in Bangladesh, remoteness. So those are the reasons where the inequality in income originates. But we also see that the nature of inequality is just not the income inequality, but also, for example, dignity is also, for example, it was mentioned that Dalits, for example, it's also associated with issues of dignity. In some areas, it is regional inequality, gender dimension of inequality. So all of these will have to be addressed if we want to address the issues of inequality. So in terms of how to address it, one issue that came up very strongly is that our allocation for education and health, it's not only it's in South Asia, it's less than, for example, in case of health, WHO normalized allocation, a percentage of GDP, or say in terms of education, the UNESCO, 4% of the GDP at least. So we see that that is not there. So we have to increase the allocation. The second is the fiscal, that is the fiscal part of it. The second issue, which is also that in most of our countries in South Asia, we see the dependence on indirect tax. But by itself, it also perpetuates inequality in the sense that we are not taxing the rich enough. So it was mentioned that that is also something that we have to take into consideration. The other is, for example, financial inclusion is becoming very important. The poor are not getting, for example, the loans and the credits which they want to get. Even when they get, there is corruption and it doesn't address their, they don't get the real money. So that is also something which was a financial inclusion as addressing the issues of inequality. Labor market policies, it was very strongly mentioned in our session that many of the rules and labor regulations are anti-labor, rights of the labor. Whether the minimum wages should go into not only the minimum wage discourse, but also livelihood discourses. So those are also some of the structural issues which we mentioned. One of the other issues which came up is the global dynamics which perpetuates inequality in low-income countries. And there the democratization of the global institutions also came up. For example, the voting rights in IMF and World Bank, WTO reforms, particularly, for example, the market access that the least developed countries have, and the data shows that although it has increased between 2010 and 2018 from 40% to 60% of the goods from the LDCs going under the duty-free, quota-free, but we also find that there is a lot of areas to go. Or the global commitment, 0.15% of the ODA going to the LDCs, that only 8 countries have fulfilled that. So the global architecture of the institutions also are some of the reasons where it originates. The other issue, which is also one of the targets in Goal 10, is migration and remittances. And what we also see is that although there is a Colombo process in our region, we are not making effective use of it. And the enforcement of labor regulations and labor rights in the host countries. So one recommendation was to really strengthen the Colombo process within with the participation of the South Asian countries. The other was one of the indicators in Goal 10 is to reduce the cost of migration and also the cost of transfer of money. And there, for example, the average is now the cost of transfer of remittances is 7%. But the global target which has been set in the SDGs is 3%. So what is being suggested is that the processes where the South Asian countries are there, both in terms of the Colombo process, in terms of reducing the cost of remittances, particularly in the current dispensation, we see that because of the security reasons, even small remittances which are being transferred, these are being taxed, and banks are passing on the additional costs on the small remitters. So whether there can be a global also concordance with regard to not to charge those on a small remitters. So this is also something. The other issue which was not discussed, but I would like to mention, if we want to really reduce inequality across countries, obviously the SDGs talk about the LDCs, but there are, within South Asia, there are 3 countries which will be graduating very soon, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan. So I think that there should be also some measures in the WTO and global forum to help the graduation of the graduating LDCs. I think that will also help reduce the disparity across the LDCs and across the countries. So, what transpired is from our discussion is in one sentence is that if we can really address goal 10, and addressing goal 10 is also associated with, for example, goal 4 and other goals. If you can address goal 10, then obviously the other goals, for example, ending poverty, zero hunger, we will be able to do it. And the efficiency of allocation will be very important. And the rights of the people, to look at it not just as an allocative efficiency issue, but as a rights issue, I think is becoming very important if you want to really mean business. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. You have done an excellent summary of the discussion around SDG 10 within a strong normative framework of balanced regional development, balanced in terms of reduction of inequality within as well as across the countries. May I now request Mr. Sonam Wangadi, he's the Secretary, National Environment Commission, Bhutan. He will present us the perspective on SDG 13.
Madam Chairperson, distinguished panelists on the dais, distinguished participants, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I was the convener for SDG 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. And we had 3 panelists, Mr. Anil Kumar Jain, in his place, Mr. Prasad was there, who was Joint Secretary, Ministry of Environment, Dr. Abid Sulero from Pakistan, and Ms. Hanik Mohagani from Iran. The group also had very intense discussions, and we had so much discussions that I think we even could not take much notes. Basically, in fact, I don't know where my rapporteur is also. We actually tried to take stock of the situation in South Asia, and we've agreed that we have a robust agreement at the international level, UNFCCC, and the Paris Agreement. And the countries are in the process of internalizing or incorporating these into their policies and plans. Most countries have communicated their nationally determined contributions. However, as the name sounds, take urgent action to combat climate change. I think talking with my colleagues